Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to another big ol' 40k lore video. Today we will be taking a look at the Tau. The Tau are a young, by galactical standards, humanoid race inhabiting the eastern fringes, a mostly unexplored area of space bordering the Imperium. More on that later though. First we will talk a bit about the Tau physiology. The Tau, as a species, is currently divided into 5 subspecies, known as castes. These castes are Fire, or Shas, Earth, Theo, Water, Pur, and Air, Kur, and lastly a somewhat separate caste, the Ethereals, the Aun. Note that I use the term subspecies, though. You see, originally the castes were merely different tribes with some minor differences. However, after the Ethereals took control, inbreeding between the castes was strictly forbidden. This has led the castes to develop in very specialized ways over the course of thousands of years. For example, the Fire caste has become the warrior caste of the Tau Empire, and so they are bigger and stronger than the average Tau. But for now we will talk about the general traits of the Tau. They are of comparable height to humans and look quite similar to us monkeys in their general appearance. Their faces, however, are unmistakably alien. Their skin is rough and leathery and exudes almost no moisture. The face is almost completely flat with no nose and an eye-shaped slit running down the center of their face to slightly below their eyes. Though it might look like it, this is not an olfactory organ. It is simply a pair of ass cheeks on their face. It's just a thing they have. Their nose is in fact inside of their mouth. Silly place to put it, but hey. As for their vision, a fairly important trait to a race that prefers ranged warfare, is slightly better than human eyesight. Their visual spectrum extends a little more into the ultraviolet and infrared wavelengths than us humans. However, their pupils do not dilate. This gives them poorer depth perception and provides slower vision-focusing reflexes than humans. In general, and by the way, that's in Fire caste general, the Tau warrior is slightly weaker than a baseline human, potentially quite a lot weaker than a trained soldier, and a complete pussy when compared to an Adeptus Astartes. Their eyesight also hinders them somewhat in melee, but they more than make up for this weakness by simply not getting into close combat in the first place, and we'll get back to that in greater detail later on. Before we move on to some history, I would first like to talk about these various castes, and their duties within Tau society. As for the integrated races though, I will give them a video of their own, except for some basic mentions throughout this video. First up, we will start with the Builders, the Earth caste. They are the workers of the Tau Empire and contain everything from farmers to scientists, from mechanics to artisans. They build, produce, and develop virtually everything used by the modern Tau Empire. Years of selective breeding have made them stout of build compared to the other Tau, and have also given them a somewhat more focused and pragmatic mindset. Or at least, that's their take on it. Other Tau might describe them as weapons-grade monotonous. Then there's the Air caste, the complete reverse of the Earth caste. The Air caste operate the Tau's spaceships and aircraft and have developed themselves over the course of generations of Tau that have been born and bred in space to fill these roles as effectively as possible. They are tall and slender with very little muscle mass and hollow bones. This is due to most Tau ships operating with very little to no gravity. This lets the Tau's ships skimp on complicated and expensive artificial gravity generators, and saving space is vital for the Tau, as they need to transport as much as possible since their ships are fairly slow. Tau ships cannot fully enter the warp, quite like Imperial ships, and must limit themselves to short skips through the warp. This is safer than full warp entry, but also much slower. Due to this limitation, most Aircast members crew mercantile ships, as the Tau Empire requires a massive amount of such ships, but of course they also need military craft, and the Aircast also crew the smaller aircraft of the Tau fleet. Now, this requires a special mention. You see, since the Aircast have limited muscle mass and hollow bones of a almost entirely space-based population, in fact, the Aircast members do not in fact live on planets, they usually live on orbital colonies, you would expect them to be amazing void fighters, but close to worthless atmospheric pilots. This, of course, is due to the simple fact that air combat at supersonic speed puts an enormous strain on the body. A human pilot's limits with training and a J-suit is circa 9 positive sustained Gs, and around half that in negative Gs. Additionally, human pilots can take considerably higher levels of G-forces for shorter periods of time. Considering now that a Tau Fire Warrior is circa 10 to 20% weaker than a human soldier of comparable size, and that an Aircast member is significantly weaker than a Firecast member, the reason I bring this up is because in the fluff, it is stated that the Aircast members are fantastic pilots during atmospheric combat. Something I frankly find damn hard to believe, as their limit for sustained G-forces should be in the 3 to 4 G range, and that is being very generous considering their physical capabilities and limitations, and it also assumes that the Tau flight suits are vastly superior to Imperial suits, which is a fair assumption. This low tolerance would put extreme limitations, however, on the maneuverability and speed of Tau aircraft, and at best, they would be limited to late World War II level aircraft, and even that, again, is being extremely optimistic. I tried to find an explanation to this in my various sourcebooks, but I could honestly find nothing to adequately explain why Tau Aircast members are so damn good at atmospheric combat. Now, of course, there is the basic excuse that, well, they have been piloting crafts their entire lives, and as such, they've gotten pretty good at it. Yeah, certainly. Additionally, their better eyesight also gives them advantage in air combat. However, there's still the fact that they will be turned to smush if they ever try to get above, well, 1,000 kilometers an hour, essentially, which, you know, considering that the Imperial Thunderbolt air superiority fighter has a top speed of 2,200 kilometers an hour, this seems like it would be an incredibly one-sided confrontation. So, while I am usually the first to defend virtually anything in 40k when it comes to a realistic basis, I think this one might have to be notched up to, cuz fluff. But that's enough bullying of the poor air blueberries though. Let's move on to the Water Caste. The Water Caste is the Tau Empire's diplomats, statesmen, and merchants. Their role within the greater good is to make sure that everything runs smoothly, and that the various castes are cooperating to the best of their abilities, and of course that various institutes are carrying out their assigned tasks with exemplary Tau efficiency. They are also responsible for the integration of non-Tau member species and diplomatic overtures towards other races. And they're damn good at it too. Their faces are softer and less rigid than that of most Tau, as most Taus are essentially incapable of anything but the most basic of facial expressions. And this, along with considerable intellect and skills in the art of diplomacy, allows the Water Caste to mimic the mannerism of other races to an astounding degree, and this essentially in an effort to make the other races feel safe, to make them feel like they're talking to something they can recognize, you know? A water caste diplomat is able to adapt whatever persona he thinks would be most effective. He can be a kind and gentle soul, merely advising on what is the best for his listeners, or a stern authoritarian figure to cow and subjugate those weak of mind. They also possess a nearly supernatural ability to interpret other races' emotions and thoughts to the point where their reading of faces and mannerism can appear almost like they are mind readers to those who are not aware of their skills and the decades of training that most diplomats have in the arts of reading facial expressions and micro-gestures. They read body language to an absolutely astounding degree because, well, this is their job. They dedicate practically their entire life to interpreting other species. So, as you can imagine, they've gotten pretty goddamn good at it. And then, of course, we have the Fire Caste, the soldier caste of the Tau Empire. These Tau are bred to be larger and stronger than the other Tau castes, though they are still somewhat weak by human standards. They make up for this with a rigorous system of training and drilling put down in the Code of Fire, a guide on everything a Tau warrior might need, from a comprehensive training program to the rules of military conduct and honor, and also the primary values that a fire warrior is expected to live by, namely honor, obedience, duty, and self-sacrifice. Very feudal Japanese. Make no mistake though, their way of the warrior may sound archaic, but the fire warriors are a superbly trained and disciplined troop. And in this regard, they are the equal of even Cadian Imperial Guardsmen. And unlike parts of the Imperial Guard, the Fire Caste is a strict meritocracy, where everyone has the exact same chances of reaching higher ranks, be they Tau, Vespid, human, male or female. They all work by the same rules and requirements. The line of advancement, however, is less fluid than in the Guard, where promotions are usually handed out in recognition of talent or abilities, or of course by necessity, combat casualties, etc. For Tau, the first step on his military career, well, that starts virtually at birth by the way, is as a chasse sal, which is a recruit's rank that he or she will keep until joining the army proper and becoming a chasselas, or line trooper. Then, if the Tau survives 4 years of service, he gets to attempt his first trial by fire. This is an ancient ritual that varies from sept to sept, and a sept, by the way, is the Tau's rough equivalent of an imperial sector. These trials are usually quite brutal, and success is by no means guaranteed, but should the Tau complete his trial, he gains the rank of chasseur, and the honor of piloting a battle suit. After another 4 years, he can undergo his next trial to become a chassevray, which is essentially a hero's rank. Very, very few Tau actually achieve this rank. And then in another 4 years, he can attain the rank of chassel, a commander in training, and then finally a chasseur, a full Tau commander. These trials get progressively harder, so very, very few make it to the rank of chassevray, and much, much less chasseur. And by the way, only chasseur commanders are allowed to retire from service, where they usually end up becoming advisors. Now, it's pretty damn rare for an Imperial Guardsman to get out of the Guard, but for Tau Firewar it is quite literally go all the way to a full commander or get killed. There is no other way out of the Tau military. Now, having covered the 4 basic castes, we now have to look at the last segment of Tau society, namely the Celestial Caste, also known as the Ethereals, the self-styled philosopher kings of the Tau Empire. The Ethereals rule over the Tau with absolute and unquestioned authority. via unknown means. We'll get to this a little bit again later, but whatever they are using, though, is damn effective, as a member of the Celestial Caste can command the Tau to take his own life and be met with instant, unquestioning obedience. All Ethereals, of course, hold leadership positions. It is their birthrights within the Empire, but there are also ranks within the Ethereal Caste that can differ. For example, a lower rank will be given command of a military unit or expedition, or perhaps an individual world, or even just an individual city in case of larger worlds, with the highest ranking members among the Ethereal Caste serving on the Ethereal Council on their homeworld of Tau. And this council is again led by an Ethereal Supreme, the de facto leader of the Tau Empire. And this one requires a little bit of special mention again. The Ethereal Supreme has such a massive amount of control over all of the Tau that even just the thought of questioning him will seem like complete and utter nonsense to all Tau. They couldn't even understand the concept of questioning him. There is a mention in the Tau Fluff that to even suggest that he might be wrong would be considered boorish and rude in the extreme, and essentially a capital offense. Now, the last known Ethereal Supreme was Aunva. Now, I say last known because unfortunately for him, he got himself trapped and isolated in a bunker complex during the Second Grellan campaign, and even more unfortunate was the fact that he was sharing his new hidey hole with an Imperial Colexus assassin. Needless to say, Aunva was never heard of again. Well, unless of course you think that retching noises made by the Taus assigned to hose him off the walls count, but other than that, yeah, he was never heard of again. After that grisly story, we'll look at some history. Now, about the Tau, or the Tau as they refer to themselves, or those plasma-spamming sons of Smurf shit as they are known, less seriously, by those unfortunate enough to fight them, and potentially the dice gods on the tabletop, the Tau can be a truly infuriating opponent, just like they are presented in their lore. But before we get to the uniquely frustrating art that is the Tau way of war later in the video, for now, let's first have a look at the Tau's relatively short history. Their homeworld, Tau, was discovered by Imperial explorers late in the 35th millennium by the Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessel the Land's Vision. At the time, the Tau were a primitive and highly aggressive people separated into warring tribes, all attempting to scrape a living off the dry, arid shithole they were birthed on. The planet and its population was unremarkable in the extreme, but while the planet was no garden world, it was capable of sustaining human colonization, and so the explorator fleet designated the planet to be colonized and the Smurfs to be eradicated, preferably in a slow and humiliating manner. This whole operation of wiping out the locals and colonizing a planet can be considered a relatively simple routine operation in the Imperium, but a freak warp storm isolated most of the eastern fringes from the Imperium. Normally, this would be an event of little importance. The Tau were practically a Stone Age culture, and a few thousand years of isolation would hardly make much of a difference to their abilities to resist colonization by the Imperium. But what was about to happen was far from normal series of events. The first recorded appearance of so-called Ethereals was made outside the Tau fortress city of Fuataun. The city had been under siege for 5 years by a coalition of savage Tau plains warriors. And while the city had held out for so long, it was reaching the end of its endurance, with starvation and disease spreading rapidly through the isolated population. Attempts to negotiate an end to the siege had been attempted on multiple occasions, but the plains-dwelling Tau were not the most diplomatically minded of folks, and insisted that the city must burn, presumably with most of its population still inside. A somewhat inflexible stance from a diplomatic viewpoint, I'm sure you would agree. And this is where the Ethereals come into the story. Again, I would like to ask that you remember that these are two sides that have, at this point, brutalized and murdered each other for 5 years. To the point where one of the sides refused all offers of negotiation and payment, because at this point they would rather see the other side slowly roasted over a fire pit and get little to no loot out of it, instead of having the entire city and presumably its wealth surrendered to them in exchange for letting the populace live. This, as you might agree, has gone slightly beyond the realms of a kiss and make up solution. Except, that's pretty much exactly what happened. 2 Ethereals wandered onto the scene, with one of the new leader Smurfs strolling into the presumably heavily fortified siege camp of the savage and rather unfriendly Plainstown, and the other assumably either climbed the defended stone walls of the city, or somehow talked the guards into opening the gates to a complete stranger while the city was under siege by an enemy that so far had utilized every single goddamn means at their disposal over the course of 5 fucking years to breach the walls. One would naturally assume that they had already tried subterfuge. But the diplomatic acrobatics don't stop there. Anyone would already be suitably impressed at the feats of verbal diarrhea that somehow managed to get these Ethereals into the camps unmolested in the first place. To think that they then chatter their way into each camp's respective leader's bedchamber would be mildly insane, and yet they did. The very next morning, representatives of both sides agreed to meet outside the city for a powwow, and after listening to the Ethereals explaining the virtues of love and peace for about 5 minutes, the 2 warring sides decided to kiss and make up. Now, after that mighty impressive example of pillow talk, the Ethereals continued their winning streak across the globe with their Ein Reich, Ein Führer ideology, explaining to all of the, at the time, highly violent and volatile Tau tribes that the way in which they have lived their whole lives was silly and antiquated, and that they should stop it, and it fucking worked. Now, a handful of misinformed lunatics would claim that this is not entirely natural, and that the Ethereals must have used some form of trickery to talk millions, possibly billions, of angry and violently individualistic tribes people into all being okay with the idea of a greater good dictated to them by a handful of strangers. Now, I, for one, reject these judgmental ideals and welcome our new Smurf overlords. All hail the great Blueberry. Okay, let's be serious for one brief moment though. Odds are pretty damn good that the Ethereals used some form of persuasion that is considerably more potent than words. As to what this persuasion is, well, we don't know for certain. There are theories that the Ethereal Caste secretes some form of pheromone that enables them to control other Tau in an indirect manner. Essentially, they affect them in a subconscious way, making them think that everything the Ethereal says is completely and utterly beyond reproach. There are also hints in the lore that suggests that a Tau will do literally anything at the merest suggestion from a member of the Ethereal Caste, and there's no shortage of evidence that they will follow virtually any order, no matter how insanely dangerous it may be. Another early theory was that it might have been some form of psychic trickery. Entire planets have, after being all, been known to fall under the sway of particularly powerful psyches in the past. However, this theory has been more or less completely debunked by the fact that the Tau appear to be almost completely exempt from the effects of the warp. There are no Tau Psykers, not a single one, and the Tau themselves barely register as life forms in the warp. Their warp signature is virtually indistinguishable from that of a lower animal life or plants, and therefore of virtually no interest to the creatures of the warp. So if we rule out psychic powers and really good talkie talk, then the idea that they rule over their fellow Tau by fragrant farts is less insane, if still somewhat batshit. However, there is a catch to this fanciful type of mind control. While the Ethereal Caste has complete control over other Tau, that control seems to have one pretty considerable limitation, namely that it is not a permanent condition. We know this due to the Farside Enclaves. So, what are the Farside Enclaves? Well, we'll get to that in more detail at near the end of this video, but the short version is that it was a military expedition led, as all Tau expeditions, by Ethereals. The particular area of space they ventured into, however, was somewhat hostile, and the Ethereal leaders were all killed in combat. After breaking contact with the rest of the Tau Empire, the new commander of the military expedition, by the name of Oshava, brought the remainder of his forces out into the unexplored areas of space known as the Farside Enclaves, or known today as the Farside Enclaves, and has not been heard from for a long time. In recent times, however, communications have been somewhat re-established with what is today the Farside Enclaves, a fully independent nation that violently resist all attempts by the rest of the Tau Empire to contact them, and strangely the rest of the Tau Empire seems to be happy to simply ignore them, to sweep the whole incident under the carpet. If I was a cynical man, I would argue that this probably has more to do with the Ethereals being afraid that the members of the Farside Enclave have found some way to resist their diplomatic skills than them simply wishing to let these poor, unguided souls live in peace. But aside from this minor embarrassment, the Ethereals have pretty much complete control over the rest of the Empire via their privilege of birth and their mysterious gifts. But is this a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it is a pretty harsh oligarchy that tolerates literally no dissent, not by violent oppression, but by some unknown process of indoctrination and mind control. But it does work pretty damn well. The Tau Empire is by far the most technologically progressive faction in the galaxy, and there's a pretty damn solid argument to be made that technological achievement equals greater prosperity and happiness for the general population, and this does appear to be the case in the Tau Empire. In fact, they appear to have it so good that many other races willingly submit themselves to the Tau Empire as member species, and even Imperial worlds have been known to at least entertain the possibility of joining the Tau Empire, although such free thinking usually leads to the local government having some form of unfortunate accident involving their anus in a power mall. So all in all, as long as you don't object to living in a fragrant version of Nazi Germany, the Tau Empire is a pretty damn good place to live. You get automatic coffee makers and everything. Now, I'll have this be the end of part 1 of the Tau Empire, in an effort to try and make these videos appear a little bit less insane to those who are not already initiated into the glorious cult of the Bridge God and his arch-rambler Arch. So, until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.